Good morning, champions, and happy Monday. Today we are going to start a new skill. You have 4 days before we take the practice leap and 29 days before we take the actual leap. I am so proud of the work that you have done so far and know that you're going to do an amazing job. Let's dive right in. Mr. Smiles, he's rooting for you. Let's start with our first do now problem. What is 1/5 plus 3/4? Well, first of all, before I can add or subtract fractions, what do they need to have? They need to have the same denominator. I'm going to draw my t-chart. Remember, I don't need to draw my t-chart when I'm multiplying or dividing, but when I'm adding or subtracting fractions, I have to have that same denominator. What's the least common denominator for 1/5 and 3/4? The least common denominator for 1/5 and 3/4 is 20. So I need to change both fractions so that the denominator is 20. When I change 1/5 so that the denominator is 20, what's my new fraction? Well, 5 times 4 is 20. 1 times 4 is 4. When I change 3/4 so that the denominator is 20, what's my new fraction? Well, 4 times 5 is 20. 3 times 5 is 15. Now I can add 4 over 20 plus 15 over 20. What do I get when I add those two fractions? I get 19 over 20. Now you try one. Remember, when I subtract fractions, it's the same thing. I just subtract the numerators instead of adding them. Go ahead and see what you get for 5/6 minus 1/8. When I subtract 5/6 minus 1/8, the first thing I need to do is draw my t-chart. I know that I can list the multiples of 6 and the multiples of 8 to find my least common denominator. The least common denominator is 24. 5/6 is the same as 20 over 24, and 1/8 is the same as 3 over 24. When I subtract, I get 17 over 24. Find the volume for each rectangular prism. Remember, to find the volume, multiply length times width times height. What's the volume of the first rectangular prism, the one on the left? The correct volume is 120 cubic centimeters. 5 times 4 is 20, times 6 is 120. I could have also said 6 times 4 is 24, times 5 is 120. Now, find the volume of the rectangular prism on the right. Start by finding the length, width, and height. The correct length, width, and height are 3, 4, and 3. When I multiply 3 times 4 to find out how many cubes are on the bottom layer, I get 12. Then, when I multiply by 3, I get 36 cubic units. Now let's do some decimal multiplication. I'm going to multiply 3 and 5/10 times 0 and 12/100. Remember, when I add or subtract decimals, I need to line them up, but when I multiply, I don't. In this particular problem, I'm multiplying tenths times hundredths. So my answer is going to be in the thousandths place. There's going to be 1, 2, 3 numbers behind the decimal. After that, I can just multiply like normal. What's 35 times 12, as if there was no decimal there? Well, 5 times 2 is 10, 2 times 3 is 6, plus 1 more is 7. Drop my 0. 1 times 5 is 5, and 1 times 3 is 3. When I add, I get 420. How do I place the decimal, knowing that I need 3 digits behind the decimal point? Well, I can count over 1, 2, 3. The answer is 0 and 420 thousandths. Now you try one. What's 4 and 7/10 times 0 and 18/100? I counted and saw there are 1, 2, 3 digits behind the decimal. My answer will be in the thousandths place. When I multiply 47 times 18, I get 846. I can correctly place the decimal by placing 3 digits behind it. The correct answer is 846 thousandths. Last do now questions. Let's compare some decimals. Let's start with the first example. Compare 3 times 10 plus 2 times 1 plus 3 times 1 over 100 to 32 and 29 thousandths. First, let's write these numbers in standard form. How do I write 3 times 10 plus 2 times 1 plus 3 times 1 over 100 in standard form? Well, 3 is in the tens place, 2 is in the ones place, and 3 is in the hundredths place. How do I write 32 and 29 thousandths in standard form? Well, 32 before the decimal and 29 in the thousandths place. So now I need to compare 32 and 29 thousandths and 32 and 3 hundredths. Remember, I can place zeros at the end. 30 thousandths is larger than 29 thousandths. So 32 and 3 hundredths is larger. Now you try one. What's larger? What's greater? 5 times 1/10 plus 2 times 1 over 1,000 or 51 hundredths? Well, the first number is 502 thousandths. 51 hundredths is greater because 1 in the hundredths place is greater than 0 in the hundredths place. Today we are going to talk about how to read and interpret a line plot. A line plot is a way of showing data and showing how frequently or how often different data points occur. This line plot shows time spent studying by several students. At the top of every line plot is a title that tells us the main idea or what that line plot is mostly about. At the bottom, we can see the label for the axis that tells us what each data point shows. Here I can see it's hours. So there's 1/4 of an hour, 1/2 of an hour, 3/4 of an hour, 1 hour, 1 1/4, 1 1/2, and 1 3/4. The way that line plots display data is by placing an X for each data point. So you can see that over 1/4 hours there are 3 X's. Each X represents 1 student. So 3 students studied for 1/4 of an hour. How many students studied for 1/2 of an hour? Well, 1 student studied for 1/2 of an hour. How many students studied for 3/4 of an hour? Well, 2 students studied for 3/4 of an hour. You might be asked, how many students spent time studying last week? You could count up all of the X's to figure that out. So how many students spent time studying last week? There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 total students who spent time studying last week, because there are 10 X's on our line plot. The last kind of question you might be asked is, what is the total amount of time spent studying last week? Well, to do that, we would need to add the time studied by each student. So we would have 10 different numbers to add. I can draw my T-chart to get started, and I'm going to add 1/4, 3 times, 1/4, 1/4, 1/4. I'm going to add 1/2 1 time. I'm going to add 3/4 2 times. I'm going to add 1 1/4 1 time. And I also need to add 1 3/4 3 times. Now, I can break these into chunks and then add those chunks together. So let's start by adding 1/4 plus 1/4 plus 1/4. What's 1/4 plus 1/4 plus 1/4? It's 3/4. 1/2 doesn't have the same denominator as 1/4, 3/4, 1 1/4, and 1 3/4. What's 1/2 equal to when I make the denominator 4? 1/2 is equal to 2/4 when I make the denominator 4. So let's add another chunk. What's 2/4 plus 3/4 plus 3/4? 2/4 plus 3/4 plus 3/4 is 8/4. Now I can add the rest. I have 1 1/4 left in this column. What's 1 3/4 plus 1 3/4 plus 1 3/4? Well, 3/4 plus 3/4 plus 3/4 is 9/4. 1 plus 1 plus 1 is 3. Now let's add all of our partial sums together. 3/4, 8/4, 1 1/4, 3 9/4. Let's start by adding our fractions. What's 3/4 plus 8/4 plus 1/4 plus 9/4? Well, 3 plus 8 is 11/4, plus 1 is 12, plus 9 is 21/4. I know that can't stay on my fraction side, so I'm going to divide 21 divided by 4. How many times does 4 go into 21? 4 goes into 21 5 times. 5 times 4 is 20. When I subtract, I have 1 left over. 5 is going to go to my whole number side, and I have 1/4 remaining as my fraction. Now I can add my whole numbers. What's 5 plus 1 plus 3? 5 plus 1 is 6, plus 3 more is 9. So I would get 9 1/4. Students spent 9 1/4 hours studying last week. Now you can try to answer some questions. This line plot shows the pounds of hot dogs eaten in an eating competition by several people. You can see that each X stands for one person. So let's answer some questions. How many people ate 1/3 pound of hot dogs? 2 people ate 1/3 pounds of hot dog. How many people ate 1 2/3 pounds of hot dogs? 3 people ate 1 2/3 pounds of hot dogs. What's the total number of people who participated in the hot dog eating contest? 9 people participated in the hot dog eating contest. There's 2, 5, 6, 9 X's. What was the total number of pounds of hot dogs eaten in the hot dog eating contest? Remember, you need to add up each number, so you should be adding 9 numbers. Do that now. When I add up the total number of pounds of hot dogs eaten, I get 4 14/3. I can change 14/3 into a mixed number. That's 4 2/3. So the total pounds of hot dogs eaten are 8 2/3. You've done a great job with this video. Now it's time to get on IXL and work on skill W12. You're going to do a fantastic job.